You can see a lot of differences between the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo in this scene. In the Sega Genesis version, the pimped out ride is a tricked out Cadillac Escalade. In the Super Nintendo version, it is a tricked out Lincoln Navigator. Actually, I made that up, but the girls are wearing different colored bikinis and the pimps are wearing different colored jackets.
Round 2, fight!
Take a full screen look here in the Super Nintendo version. One of the other standout features is that the Capcom logo right above the guys in the middle is not as colorful as it is in the Sega Genesis version. The Las Vegas on the ground is also much more pink in the Super Nintendo version. Here on the Sega Genesis version, it looks like somebody took the sharpness dial, turned it all the way up. The neon in the top right is a slightly different color, and the girls are wearing the same color bikini. What does it all mean? When playing Street Fighter II with the controllers that I own, there's really no contest. The Sega Genesis 6-button controller is by far the better controller because it keeps the 6 buttons that you would find on the arcade machine. Now, the Super Nintendo controller actually does a pretty good job with it, considering that it has the 4 buttons on the front and then the 2 on top. I find that the button on the top left is difficult to use, so both of these games give you the ability to set what actions your character does to specific buttons. So you might set this button up here to your least used move. That way when you're fighting, I find it difficult to use that at the same time that you're moving. Whereas this button up here, it's pretty easy to use. However, this is not really so much of a comparison because this is a specialty controller, this is the stock controller, and you can go out and buy special controllers just for fighting games.
Bang!
Whether you're playing on the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis, you're fighting in streets all around the world because Street Fighter II is a global game. And here we're fighting Vega in Spain, and it's a cage match in a restaurant. And I've never been to a restaurant that has cage match fighting in it. But that would certainly make it easy to gamble, drink, and eat dinner all in one convenient spot. Which is what these people are doing, and they even have dancers. Check it out, the Sega Genesis and the SNES versions put the dancers into different colored outfits.
You win!
The people in the background are also wearing some different colors. We'll do a split screen here. Where you can see some more close-up details on how the graphics differ between the two different game systems. Alright, this guy. He's always a pain in the ass. Here's another look at how the two game systems handle graphics differently. With the Super Nintendo being much smoother and the Genesis having much higher contrast and sharpness. After you pound the crap out of this guy, the ending screen on both of the systems looks the same. Not like when you pound Blanca, and the Sega Genesis version is much bloodier, as we showed in the Part 1. Here we get to M. Bison, who has a different colored cape depending on what version of the game you're playing.
Round 1, fight!
And also on the left side of the screen there's this building. You can see it has steeples or something on it, and they stand out a bit more in the Genesis version than they do on the Super Nintendo. So, what is the final verdict in this classic game room review of Street Fighter II versus Street Fighter II? Which version is better? I guess it really depends on what game system you own. If you own a Super Nintendo, I'd get the Super Nintendo version.
And if you have a Sega Genesis, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to fit a Super Nintendo game cartridge into it. Both of these games are excellent because Street Fighter II is an excellent game. There's also numerous other versions of Street Fighter II out there. I think when you look at these from the 16-bit console perspective, they're nearly identical. Gameplay is terrific. I think some people might find the graphics on the Super Nintendo better because they prefer that smoothness, whereas the Sega Genesis gives you a much higher contrast, sharpness, and looks more pixelated in a way. The audio quality is completely different between the two games, and my personal opinion is that the Sega Genesis version looks and plays better, but that the Super Nintendo version sounds better. But when you can buy both of them for $5 combined, who cares? And that's the conclusion. In the end, you're going to end up playing whichever game you like, depending on if you like the Super Nintendo or the Sega Genesis. But I think we can all agree, even if we're on the Sega side or the Nintendo side, that playing Street Fighter II is better than watching the Street Fighter II movie. That's not even an opinion, that's a fact.